The rain pounded mercilessly against the tin roof of the auction barn, creating a somber rhythm that matched Emma's heartbeat. As she sat frozen in her truck, she gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, eyes fixed on the weathered building ahead. This wasn't just another Saturday sale. For Emma, it represented her final desperate attempt to salvage a dream that had been slipping through her fingers for years. The auction catalog lay open on the passenger seat, its pages dog-eared and marked with hesitant circles around possibilities that would likely disappoint her yet again. The parking lot filled with gleaming trucks pulling custom trailers worth more than her entire savings. Wealthy buyers emerged in pressed shirts and spotless boots that had never known real barn work. Emma caught her reflection in the rearview mirror, the dark circles under her eyes, the tension lines around her mouth that hadn't been there 3 years ago. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her, so different from the confident rider she had once been. 5 years of searching, 5 years of disappointments, near misses and horses that weren't quite right. 5 years of watching her bank account dwindle along with her hope. This auction was her ultimatum to the universe. Find something today, or finally accept that some dreams weren't meant to come true. The thought sent a physical ache through her chest as she finally gathered the courage to step out into the drizzling rain. The familiar scent of sawdust, hay and horse sweat enveloped her as she slipped through the heavy doors. The auction house hummed with activity, handlers prepping nervous horses, buyers consulting pedigree papers, the auctioneer testing his microphone with sharp taps that echoed through the cavernous space. Emma chose a seat in the back row, away from the serious buyers with their sharp eyes and sharper judgments. Her gaze wandered over the crowd, recognizing the types if not the faces. The wealthy hobby farmers who would lose interest in 6 months, the dealers looking for quick turnarounds, the trainers seeking diamonds in the rough. And then there was Emma, the dreamer, who couldn't let go, making one last pilgrimage to the altar of possibility. The first horse entered the ring, a flashy chestnut with high step and obvious breeding. The bidding quickly soared beyond what Emma could afford. She watched horse after horse parade through, some magnificent, some serviceable, all finding new homes with confident buyers who knew exactly what they wanted. As the hours passed, Emma's hope dimmed like the afternoon light filtering through the dusty windows. Perhaps this had been a mistake. Perhaps it was finally time to admit defeat and sell her empty barn, her unused tack, her collection of broken dreams. And then the auctioneer announced the final lot of the day. Emma watched the horses parade through the auction ring with the eyes of someone who had once belonged in a world now painfully out of reach. 10 years earlier, her name had been whispered with respect at competitions across 3 states. The promising junior rider with the natural seat, the girl who could communicate with difficult horses through some invisible connection that trainers twice her age envied. Back then, her future had seemed mapped in ribbons and trophies, in the steady ascent toward greater heights. The centerpiece of that dream had been Monarch, a powerful thoroughbred gelding with a coat like burnished copper and a spirit that matched Emma's own determination. Together they had been poetry in motion, clearing fences with a synchronicity that made spectators hold their breath. Championships had seemed inevitable until that rainy April morning when everything changed forever. The jump had been challenging, but not impossible. They had cleared higher, wider obstacles dozens of times before, but the combination of slick ground, a moment's hesitation, and a sudden sharp crack as the top rail splintered had sent them crashing down in a tangle of limbs and broken dreams. The memory still came to Emma in nightmares. The sickening sensation of falling, Monarch's scream of pain, the horrifying crack that wasn't wood but bone. Emma had recovered from her physical injuries after months of physical therapy, the shattered collarbone, the concussion, the 3 broken ribs, but Monarch never competed again. The fracture in his cannon bone had healed imperfectly despite the best veterinary care money could buy. Emma had kept him, of course, retiring him to a quiet life in her parents' pasture. But the guilt shadowed her every time she looked into his eyes. Something had broken inside her that day too. Something crucial that connected her to the fearless girl she had once been. Since then, she had tried other horses. Safe, reliable schoolmasters. Her former trainer insisted would rebuild her confidence. She had tried lesson programs, trail riding groups, even a brief stint working at a therapy stable, but each attempt ended the same way, with Emma frozen in fear the moment anything unpredictable happened, her body remembering the fall while her mind screamed at her to push through. Eventually, the trainers gave her that knowing look, that mixture of disappointment and resignation that spoke more clearly than words ever could. Perhaps it was time to find another passion. Perhaps horses weren't in her future after all. So here she sat, 5 years later, in a last-ditch effort to reconnect with the world that had once defined her. Emma had purchased a small farm with her savings, built a modest 2-stall barn, and repaired fencing with her own hands. All for a horse she hadn't found yet. For a dream she couldn't quite surrender. Today would determine whether that dream lived or died, whether the empty stall at home would finally welcome an occupant, or stand as a monument to what might have been. The auction house buzzed with polite conversation and barely concealed ambition. As the wealthy and well-connected circled like sharks in expensive boots, Emma sank deeper into her hard wooden chair, acutely aware of her faded jeans and scuffed boots against the backdrop of custom-tailored jackets and designer handbags. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across the sawdust-covered ring where horses paraded one after another, their fates determined in matters of minutes by the rapid-fire calls of the auctioneer. From her back row position, Emma watched a gleaming black warm blood enter the ring, his coat reflecting the lights like polished onyx, muscles rippling beneath flawless skin. The bidding started at a figure that made her stomach clench, more than her entire savings, and quickly soared higher as manicured hands lifted confidently around the room. She recognized the winning bidder, a trainer from an elite stable, whose clients wouldn't blink at 5-figure price tags. The pattern repeated with each new horse: dressage prospects, hunter jumpers, western pleasure mounts, all finding homes with people who seemed to acquire horses as casually as others might buy groceries. Hour after hour, Emma's hope dimmed. Occasionally she'd raise her catalog slightly at a prospect within her meager budget, only to watch the bidding rapidly escalate beyond her reach. A well-dressed woman 2 rows ahead turned to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice as she commented on a bargain hunter who clearly didn't belong. Emma's cheeks burned, but she kept her expression neutral, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. The afternoon wore on. Emma checked her watch, calculating the long drive home to an empty barn and broken dreams. Perhaps this had been foolish from the start. This desperate last attempt to reclaim a piece of herself that had shattered years ago. The practical voice in her head, the one that sounded suspiciously like her father, reminded her that dreams didn't pay bills, and sentiment was a luxury she could no longer afford. A chestnut quarter horse with flashy white stockings, sold to a gentleman in the front row, who didn't even look up from his phone as he made the winning bid. A Palomino, with show-stopping movement, went to a trainer from 3 counties over. Emma's catalog drooped in her lap, most pages unmarked now, as reality settled over her like dust. She gathered her jacket, preparing to slip out before the end, to begin the process of letting go. The auctioneer's voice cut through her thoughts, announcing the final lot of the day. There was something in his tone, a subtle shift from the practiced enthusiasm he'd maintained for hours, that made Emma pause. She glanced toward the entry gate just as the handlers led in the last horse, and the entire auction house seemed to hold its breath. The murmurs began immediately, a wave of disappointment and dismissal rippling through the crowd as Emma leaned forward, suddenly alert, her departure forgotten, as she stared at the broken creature that had just entered the ring. The final lot of the day stumbled into the ring, a stark contrast to the glossy, well-muscled animals that had preceded him. The bay gelding moved with hesitant steps, his coat dull and patchy where it stretched too tight over protruding ribs and angular hip bones. Scars crisscrossed his flanks, telling silent stories of neglect, or worse, while his overgrown hooves suggested months without proper care. The handler tugged impatiently at the lead rope, forcing the horse to stand in the center of the arena, though it was clear the animal would have preferred to shrink into invisibility. Whispers rippled through the crowd, no longer bothering with the pretense of politeness. A woman in the front row gathered her catalog and purse, heading for the exit with a dismissive wave of her hand. A well-known trainer leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, examining the ceiling as if suddenly fascinated by the rafters. Even the auctioneer's practiced enthusiasm faltered as he began his introduction, his voice flat as he announced this final offering with no mention of breeding, training, or potential. The starting bid was insultingly low, yet met with silence. The auctioneer repeated the figure, his tone edged with impatience. As the bay shifted uncomfortably under the harsh lights and colder stares, Emma sat frozen in her seat, unable to look away despite the painful tightness growing in her chest. There was something about this horse that reached past the visible damage, something in the quiet way he held himself, neither panicking nor surrendering completely to his circumstances. As the auctioneer prepared to move on, perhaps to retire this final lot without a sale, the bay gelding lifted his head slightly. The movement wasn't dramatic, yet it transformed him. For a brief moment, Emma glimpsed what this horse might have been before the world broke him. The proud arch of his neck, the perfect proportion of his head, the inherent balance in his stance. Despite everything, dignity remained. Then his eyes found hers. Emma had heard stories of connections that transcended understanding. Moments when horse and human recognized something essential in one another. She had dismissed such tales as romantic nonsense, the wishful thinking of people who anthropomorphized animals beyond reason. Yet in that moment, as those dark eyes locked with hers across the crowded auction house, something inexplicable passed between them. The bay's gaze wasn't pleading or desperate. There was a weary acceptance there, a resignation that struck Emma with painful familiarity. This was a horse who had given up, who expected nothing from a world that had shown him only indifference or cruelty. It was the same expression Emma had seen in her own mirror countless mornings after the accident. The look of someone who had lost faith not just in others but in themselves. The auctioneer's voice seemed to come from a great distance as he prepared to pass over the unsold lot. Without conscious decision, Emma raised her hand. The moment stretched between them, like an invisible thread, taut with recognition that defied explanation. Emma's raised hand remained frozen in the air, yet she was barely aware of it. The auction house, with its noise and smells and judgmental stares, seemed to fade into a distant blur. There was only the bay gelding now, his dark eyes holding hers across the crowded space with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Time slowed. In that gaze, Emma saw more than just an animal's instinctive weariness. There was something deeper, a wounded intelligence, a weariness born of betrayal rather than simple exhaustion. This was a horse who had once trusted, who had perhaps even once loved, and who had learned the harsh lesson that such vulnerability led only to pain. Each scar on his body told a story, but the real damage lay beneath the surface, in places veterinary medicine couldn't reach. Emma knew that look. She had worn it herself for 5 long years, had seen it reflected back at her in mirrors and storefront windows and the pitying glances of former competitors. It was the expression of someone who had fallen from grace and couldn't remember how to stand tall again. Someone who had been broken not just physically, but in spirit. The bay's ears flickered forward, his nostrils flaring slightly, as if catching her scent across the distance. For a heartbeat, something shifted in his posture. Not hope exactly, but a subtle straightening, a momentary flash of the proud animal he might have been before the world had beaten him down. He was seeing her just as clearly as she was seeing him. Emma felt something crack inside her chest, some frozen place beginning to thaw. For years, she had been searching for the perfect horse, one with flawless conformation, Impeccable training, predictable responses. She had been looking for safety, for certainty, for a guarantee against further pain. Yet here stood the opposite of everything on her carefully considered checklist, and something in her soul responded with absolute clarity. This one, this broken, scarred survivor with the knowing eyes. Around them, the auction continued. The auctioneer repeated the minimum bid with growing impatience, his gavel poised to move on. A few people glanced at Emma with expressions ranging from confusion to pity to outright derision. A trainer in the front row shook his head slightly, a warning that she was making a mistake, that this animal wasn't worth saving. But Emma couldn't look away from those eyes. In them she saw a reflection of her own journey. The fall, the pain, the struggle to find meaning afterward. And something else too, something that had been missing from her life for too long. Purpose. This wasn't just about finding a horse anymore. It was about two broken souls recognizing each other across a crowded room and reaching out one last time, despite everything. The auctioneer's voice penetrated her trance, asking if she was serious about her bid. Emma nodded, her decision already made in that single moment of connection that had changed everything. Emma's raised hand felt like a beacon in the hushed auction house, drawing stares of disbelief and whispers of judgment from across the room. The auctioneer paused, his eyebrows lifting slightly as if confirming that this wasn't some mistake. The minimum bid hung in the air between them, a paltry sum that nonetheless represented most of what remained in Emma's savings account. For a horse that most professionals would consider beyond repair, it was either an act of foolish sentimentality or extraordinary faith. A sharp laugh cut through the silence from somewhere near the front row. A well-known dealer with a reputation for flipping cheap horses for quick profit leaned toward his companion, not bothering to lower his voice as he commented on bleeding hearts, who bought broken-down animals out of misplaced pity. Heat flushed Emma's cheeks, but her hand remained steady in the air, her eyes never leaving the bay gelding who stood watching her with that strange, knowing gaze. The auctioneer called for other bids, his tone suggesting he was performing this step merely as a formality. The silence that followed confirmed what everyone in the room believed, that Emma was about to purchase not just a horse, but a problem, a money pit, a lost cause. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders. A wealthy woman in the third row turned in her seat, assessing Emma with the same critical eye she had used on the parade of horses. Her expression wasn't unkind, merely practical, as she shook her head slightly, a silent warning from one horsewoman to another. This wasn't how things were done. Purchases were meant to be strategic, calculated, sensible. Not this. Not an impulse bid on a horse that might be beyond saving. The gavel struck the podium with a crack that made Emma flinch. Just like that, it was done. The bay gelding was hers, for better or worse. The handler seemed almost relieved to be rid of his charge, thrusting the lead rope into Emma's hands with barely a glance. Up close, the horse's condition was even more heartbreaking. Ribs clearly visible beneath his dull coat, old scars mixing with newer wounds that hadn't fully healed, eyes clouded with what could only be described as resignation. As Emma led him slowly from the auction ring, past the stares and whispers, she felt a strange calmness settle over her. For the first time in years, she wasn't second-guessing herself, wasn't paralyzed by the fear of making another mistake. This felt right in a way she couldn't articulate, as if some part of her had recognized something essential in this cast-off animal. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the bay's coat, revealing hints of deeper red beneath the dirt and neglect. In that moment, Emma knew what to call him. Phoenix, a creature reborn from ashes, with the potential to rise again. As she carefully loaded her unlikely new partner into her borrowed trailer, Emma realized that for the first time since her accident, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the barn windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the golden beams. Emma stood silently outside Phoenix's stall, a mug of steaming coffee warming her hands against the early spring chill. Inside, the bay gelding remained pressed against the far corner, his body tense and vigilant despite the clean straw bedding, fresh water, and untouched hay that Emma had provided the night before. His eyes tracked her every movement, not with curiosity, but with the weariness of an animal who had learned that human attention rarely meant anything good. 3 days had passed since the auction, and Phoenix had barely moved from that corner, except when absolutely necessary. He accepted food only when Emma retreated far enough away, and he flinched at the slightest unexpected sound. The veterinarian, who had come the day after arrival, had been brutally honest. After examining him, malnutrition, poorly healed injuries, possible neurological damage from what appeared to be old head trauma. The prognosis wasn't hopeless, but it wasn't encouraging either. Some scars, the vet had warned, weren't just physical. Emma set her coffee down on a hay bale and picked up a soft brush, approaching the stall with slow, deliberate movements. Phoenix's muscles tensed visibly, his ears pinning back as she unlatched the door. She paused, keeping her body language open and unthreatening, simply standing in the doorway without advancing further. This had become their morning ritual, a careful dance of boundaries and patience, of offered connection met with deep suspicion. Minutes ticked by. A barn swallow swooped through the open door, chattering noisily, before disappearing again into the bright morning. Emma remained still, the brush hanging loosely at her side. Finally, almost imperceptibly, something in Phoenix shifted. His ears moved forward slightly, his head lowering just a fraction of an inch. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, a tiny concession that perhaps this human might be different. Emma took a single step forward, then stopped again. She had learned to read his body, the tightening around his eyes that preceded flight, the subtle shift of weight that signaled fear. Today, for the first time, he allowed her 3 steps closer than yesterday, before those warning signs appeared. She retreated immediately, respecting his boundary, and settled on the straw just inside the stall door, her back against the wall. Sitting there, speaking softly about nothing in particular, Emma noticed a pattern of marks along Phoenix's front legs she hadn't seen before. Chain marks, evidence of harsh restraint that told its own story about why this horse feared humans so deeply. Anger flashed through her, quickly contained. Phoenix didn't need her rage at whoever had treated him this way. He needed her patience, her consistency, her willingness to prove that not all hands caused pain. As the sun climbed higher, casting the stall in warm light, Emma simply sat and observed her broken horse. Each scar, each flinch, each moment of weariness was a piece of a puzzle she was slowly assembling. Phoenix wasn't just a project to fix. He was a being with his own history, his own trauma, his own legitimate reasons for mistrust. Healing would come not from forcing or rushing, but from the slow building of a bridge across the chasm of his fear. Weeks melted into months as the seasons shifted from spring's hesitant warmth to the full heat of summer. The small farm that had once felt like a monument to Emma's broken dreams slowly transformed into something else entirely. A sanctuary where 2 wounded souls learned to trust again, one painstaking day at a time. The progress was measured not in great leaps, but in tiny victories that only Emma could fully appreciate. The morning Phoenix first approached the stall door when Emma entered with his breakfast, rather than retreating to his corner. The afternoon he allowed her to run a soft brush along his neck for 3 full minutes before stepping away. The evening he nickered softly when he heard her footsteps on the gravel path leading to the barn. Each moment represented a hard-won battle against the past that haunted them both. Emma's neighbors and the few remaining acquaintances from her competition days couldn't understand her devotion to a horse that might never be rideable, might never enter a show ring, might never fulfill the potential she had once imagined for herself. But as Phoenix's coat began to shine with proper nutrition and care, as his eyes grew brighter and more present, Emma found herself less concerned with what others thought. For the first time since her accident, she was living fully in the moment, rather than shrinking from an uncertain future. With each small breakthrough, the walls around Emma's own heart softened. The nightmares about her fall became less frequent. Her hands no longer trembled when she lifted a saddle from its rack. Even though Phoenix wasn't ready for that step, something was healing in her as she helped heal him, as if his willingness to try again somehow gave her permission to do the same. By midsummer, Phoenix would follow Emma around the small paddock without a lead rope, maintaining a careful distance, but choosing to stay in her orbit. She never pushed, never rushed, never demanded more than he could give. Instead, she offered consistency, the same gentle hands, the same soothing voice, the same respect for his boundaries, day after day, until he began to believe that perhaps this new reality wasn't a temporary illusion. On a golden afternoon in late August, Emma sat in the paddock with her back against the oak tree, reading aloud from a dog-eared novel, as had become her habit. Phoenix grazed nearby, closer than he would have permitted weeks earlier, but still maintaining his safety margin. Then something remarkable happened. A sudden clap of thunder from an approaching storm startled them both. In the past, such a sound would have sent Phoenix into a panic, racing for the far corner of the field in blind fear. This time, he raised his head sharply, ears pricked toward the distant sound. But instead of fleeing, he turned and walked deliberately toward Emma, stopping just an arm's length away. He lowered his head, nostrils flaring, as he exhaled a warm breath that ruffled the pages of her book. In that moment, something shifted between them, a silent acknowledgement that perhaps the safest place in a frightening world might be together. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and promise. As Emma stood at the fence line, watching Phoenix move across the paddock with a grace that would have seemed impossible just 6 months earlier, his once dull coat now gleamed in the morning sunlight, muscles rippling beneath the healthy shine that spoke of proper nutrition and care. But it was his eyes that had transformed most dramatically, clear and bright, no longer clouded with fear and resignation, but alive with a quiet confidence that mirrored the change in Emma herself. 1 year had passed since that fateful auction day. 1 year of patient groundwork, of gentle persistence, of rebuilding trust one small moment at a time. The local vet who had initially given such a guarded prognosis now shook his head in amazement during checkups, calling Phoenix's recovery nothing short of miraculous. But Emma knew better. There had been no miracle, only the steady healing power of consistency and compassion, the daily choice to believe in possibility rather than surrender to the past. 3 months earlier, Emma had placed a saddle on Phoenix's back for the first time. He had accepted it with only a momentary tension, his trust in her stronger than his memory of previous pain. 2 months ago, she had swung her leg over that saddle, her heart pounding, not with fear but with a strange forgotten joy. Phoenix had stood perfectly still, sensing the significance of the moment, waiting for her signal before taking a single careful step forward. Now, as the morning sun painted the fields in amber light, Emma opened the gate and walked toward Phoenix with the easy confidence of someone who had found her way home after a long journey through darkness. He met her halfway, lowering his head in greeting, his breath warm against her palm. Together they moved as if in a dance that required no music, no commands, only the invisible thread of understanding that had been forged through countless hours of patience. Emma mounted with a fluid motion, settling into the saddle that now felt like an extension of herself, rather than a precarious perch. Phoenix gathered himself beneath her, his energy contained but vibrant, waiting for the lightest touch of her leg against his side. They moved out across the open field, first at a walk, then a gentle trot that flowed into a smooth canter, as natural as breathing. The wind rushed past Emma's face, bringing tears to her eyes that had nothing to do with the chill in the air. This feeling, This perfect harmony of human and horse, moving as one, was what she had feared was lost forever. But Phoenix had given it back to her, just as she had given him back his dignity, his trust, his future. They weren't the same beings who had found each other in that auction house a year ago. They were stronger, wiser, more complete, two broken spirits who had somehow made each other whole. Thank you for watching this incredible journey of healing and transformation. If Phoenix's story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of second chances and the remarkable bond between humans and horses. Remember, sometimes the most broken beings have the most to teach us about courage and resilience. I'll hope to see you in the next video.